Recent reports have a lot of New Orleans Saints fans questioning the effectiveness of the upcoming head coach search. Let's clear some things up. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst with WWL TV. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, we'll give you 5 things to know going into Sunday's matchup with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We'll get to Darren Rizzi's potential last game with the New Orleans Saints and why the Saints do indeed intend to compete in Tampa, regardless of what it might mean or might not mean for their draft position, the Atlanta Falcons, and others. We're going to lead the show off today, though, with a look at some of the recent reporting around the New Orleans Saints head coaching staff, which has raised a lot of eyebrows from New Orleans Saints fans. So let's pull the curtain back a little bit and let's discuss what actually could be going on with the New Orleans Saints head coaching search and why, if the results you think are the results you want, you should be pretty happy with the way that things are going so far. I'll explain as we continue on with another episode of Locked On Saints. Quick one today. We appreciate you very much, whether it's your first time or your next time making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day and for being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. If you want General Manager Mickey Loomis accountable for everything that's gone on with the New Orleans Saints as of late, coming down from contract building, kicking the can down the road, building unsuccessful rosters, losing depth, all these other things, a head coaching decision on Dennis Allen. If those are all things that you think Mickey Loomis needs to be held accountable for, then I would say that the recent reporting actually kind of works in your favor. So in case you haven't seen, there have been some reports around, namely one most recently from Sportskeeda with Tony Pauline, where he mentioned that Detroit Lions defensive coordinator Aaron Glenn is likely the front runner for the New Orleans Saints head coaching job, which is certainly what we all expect as well. But the search will still be a pretty wide open search so far as we understand it for this team. It's not like they're just going to go in and hire Aaron Glenn without interviewing anybody else here. But in addition to that, within this report also came along and mentioned that one of the big things or beliefs around Aaron Glenn is that he would be willing to retain some of the coaching staff that Mickey Loomis wants to keep around. And that very quickly turned into Mickey Loomis wants to keep the entire coaching staff and Aaron Glenn's willing to do that. That's not what that means. And look, I'm not going to give anybody any grief for interpreting it that way. Editorially, I think it could have been expanded to give greater detail. It wasn't. So your only choice is to glean from it what you glean from it. But let's discuss what this actually means. It means that Mickey Loomis has some members on the New Orleans Saints coaching staff that he would like to keep around. If you've been a part of this show for a while, if you're an everydayer, that shouldn't take you by surprise. Guys like Clint Kubiak, Andrew Janocko, Clancy Barone, Keith Williams, who's the wide receivers coach. Of course, Clint Kubiak being the offensive coordinator, Andrew Janocko being the quarterback coach, Clancy Barone being the tight end coach. You get to Derek Foster, the running back coach, John Bitton, the offensive line coach. There's some names in there that I could see the New Orleans Saints being interested in keeping for a second year in order to see if the injuries impacted what 2024 turned out to be, or if they're able to stay healthier, if that coaching staff or some members of that coaching staff are still able to install and bring in the system that the Saints want, which is that wide zone system, and try to get back to the effectiveness that they saw early on in the season with a healthier roster. I'm not saying that will happen. I'm not saying that the Saints should do that. I think the Saints should seek as much change as possible, personally, outside of maybe a couple of folks in that offensive coaching staff that I could see them being willing to keep. But those are things that the New Orleans Saints would be likely to be interested in, because this is going to be an overhaul for the New Orleans Saints. It's just not going to be a one-off season overhaul. I'm sorry to tell you, but this is going to be a 2, 3, 4-year process. This isn't going to be a Houston Texans rebuild. This isn't going to be a Washington Commanders about face. This is going to be in terms of timeline, maybe not peak success, or probably certainly not peak success, but in terms of timeline, it's going to be more like a Detroit Lions situation where it took several years for them to get to the point to where they were initially competitive. And then you have to build on that success once you get there. You could look at a team like the Arizona Cardinals, who are in the thick of that right now. They're 2 years into their process. That's more akin to what you're probably going to see for the New Orleans Saints. And so when you hear things like, oh, the team might be willing to keep some coaching staff members, the team might be willing to keep some players in place, that might be true for 2025, but that doesn't mean anything for 2026 and 2027 when you're in the financial situation where you can make wider swath changes, take in more dead money and all those other things. So we have to consider that the head coaching hire isn't just about what 2025 looks like or the offseason of 2025 looks like. It's 2025, 2026, 2027, and so on. The other part that I want to really point out too, when it comes to that report, is that just because the belief is, and listen to how loose this language is, the belief is that Aaron Glenn, and now I'm going to paraphrase, is effectively willing to have that conversation, right? Is willing to consider keeping those guys around. That's not the same as Aaron Glenn is willing to keep those guys around contingent upon his employment or as a contingency for his employment or a requisite for his employment. That's not the same thing. And so even if Mickey Loomis were to approach and say, I want to keep Clint Kubiak, offensive coordinator. I want to keep Keith Williams, the wide receivers coach, because I like the work that he's done so far this season. I'd like to keep, let's say, Andrew Janocko with the young quarterbacks because they've responded to him well, and I think he's done some really innovative stuff. And I'd like to keep John Benton, the offensive line coach, because I think he's developed some of our younger guys a bit better than what we saw with like Doug Marrone and things like that. Aaron Glenn could easily say, okay, great, I hear you. I have an offensive coordinator that I like to bring in that I think will work better with those guys. And I actually have an offensive line coach from Detroit, or somebody that's worked with offensive linemen over in Detroit, who has a sustainable, successful track record of developing and fielding a successful and healthy offensive line that I want to bring. And oh, by the way, I want to change our approach to strength and conditioning and sports science. It's a negotiation. It's not just Mickey wants this, Aaron gives that. That's not the way that this is going to work. So I just want to be careful about like the way that some things are shared and the way that they're reacted to and then magnified and stuff like that. Not everything is the certainty. Not everything is the absolute when it comes to a report like that. So I just want to be careful of that. The other thing is, going back to my original point, if you want Mickey Loomis held accountable for things that you feel have not gone well for this New Orleans Saints team and objectively have not gone well for this team, right? Contracts, salary cap management, all these other things. Then you want him leading this head coach search, because if this head coach search doesn't work out, then that's where he gets held accountable. He becomes the organization's next scapegoat. You can call that fair. You can call it unfair. It doesn't matter. That's the way that the NFL works. This is what we've said from the very beginning. Once Sean Payton left, Mickey Loomis was going to get a pair of head coaching hires. He was going to get the internal guy, and then he's got to go outside the organization to go and find the next guy. And that's why I think they're going to cast a wide net. You can hire somebody familiar but still outside your organization, i.e. an Aaron Glenn, or you can go with somebody that you feel is a culture builder like a Mike Vrabel and all those other things. Your goal for 2025 is not going to be a playoff team. Your goal for 2025 is going to be establishing a new culture and establishing who fits that culture, who needs to go, who needs to remain, who are the purveyors and establishers and the guys that can create a pervasive culture, who are those that stand in the way. And then 2026, the bigger changes end up being based on that established culture. So it is an incremental process, or will be rather an incremental process for the New Orleans Saints, unless they get lucky. But more times than not, you don't get lucky in these situations. And then if that head coaching search doesn't work out, then that could spell trouble for Mickey Loomis. So yes, he has to lead it because he's the one that's going to be evaluated when it comes to whether or not this hire works or doesn't work. And if you're somebody that feels that that accountability is long overdue, then you want him either being given the opportunity to show, no, I can still put this organization in the right direction. And then if he can't, then the accountability shows up. Coming up next, let's take a look at what the New Orleans Saints have on the way. 5 things to know going into this game up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, including why it is that they do indeed intend to compete. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by friends over at PrizePicks, the easiest and most fun way to play daily fantasy sports, and my favorite way, hands down, to play daily fantasy sports as well. You can check them out over at PrizePicks.com, or you can download the PrizePicks app, which is certainly my recommendation. It's super simple. You pick 2 to 6 players. PrizePicks is going to give you a projection, a stat projection for those players. So they might say Jared Goff, 230 and a half passing yards up against the Minnesota Vikings. All you got to do is choose more or less. You do that for those 2 to 6 players. And then if you get some of those right, then you could win up to 1,000 times your initial entry back. That's what I love about PrizePicks. It's not you versus a bunch of mystery lineups. It's you versus the house with your knowledge of your favorite sports teams and players. So go and download the PrizePicks app today and use that promo code LOCKEDONNFL. You'll get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. That's your first $5 lineup, $50 instantly, win or lose, guaranteed with the PrizePicks app and the code LOCKEDONNFL. PrizePicks, run your game. The show is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp therapy online has been huge for me. I always sing its praises because it has made such a difference for me. I started using BetterHelp back during the pandemic. It's become a big part of my life and my routine, kind of a non-negotiable for me. And so when you walk into the new year here, you're thinking about new year, new me. What are the things I need to change about myself? Stuff like that. Therapy has kind of helped me change my frame for that, right? What are the things that I want to intensify about myself? What are the things that I want to highlight about myself that are my best qualities? Not what do I want to change? What do I want to lean in on? And that's where BetterHelp and therapy has been huge for me, especially in a really trying week like this one here in New Orleans. Therapy has been remarkably helpful just from the mental health side of things as well, just to have somebody else to talk to. So if you're thinking about therapy, please give BetterHelp a try today. Start your new year off right. Head over to betterhelp.com/lockedon. It's going to give you 10% off of your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up our bonus episode here on a Saturday with 5 things you need to know going into this game between the New Orleans Saints and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. A couple of little things that are kind of off the top that you already kind of know going into this one. Obviously, it's a season finale. The New Orleans Saints do not have a postseason life ahead of them. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers are win and in. The Saints right now hold the number 10 overall selection in the NFL draft. Can't really improve that much even with a loss. The best that they can get is around the 8th overall selection. Because of the lack of quarterbacks and high-end talent at high-end positions in this draft, it's a weaker draft than usual. It's not a lot of difference between pick 10 and pick 8 here this season. So with that being the case, the Saints are likely to just kind of hang around where they are and still be able to pick from the pretty much the same pool of players that they intend to pick with anyway, or would get the opportunity to pick at anyway with 10. So not a ton that the Saints can do to move the needle for themselves here in this game, with no postseason life available to them, no path in that way that they can carve, and certainly no control over not very little control over their draft positioning. But here's the thing. Saints are very unlikely to win this game anyway. So if they're going to maximize anything, it might be that draft positioning and getting to 8 or 9. Unfortunately, the teams that are ahead of them, they play teams that actually have something to play for this season or in the season finale, and therefore it doesn't work out great for the Saints in that situation. So let's go over the 5 things you really need to know about this game. And the first of which is that despite all of that, the New Orleans Saints still intend to compete in this game. It doesn't mean that they're going to win. It doesn't mean that they're going to come out on top. And in fact, I wouldn't even make that the expectation for this matchup. I think winning looks a little bit different for the New Orleans Saints. I've been saying that for the past 3 weeks. And certainly they have not done a lot of winning on the scoreboard here over the course of those weeks. And so this is just kind of the next level of that. New Orleans is in a situation to where they want to play for their city. They want to go out and at least finish with some kind of a strong performance. They're auditioning in front of 32 NFL teams. The team itself is auditioning for potential head coach across the sideline and offensive coordinator Liam Cohen. And they're trying to show that they can still compete within their division a bit. And of course, this is potentially Darren Rizzi's final game with the New Orleans Saints. It is his final game as the New Orleans Saints interim head coach. And so the team has really rallied around him. The coaching staff loves him. The roster loves him. I could see this team going out there and trying to fight hard for Darren Rizzi in his final outing, but also try to put some good tape out there for themselves as well. So I think that the Saints indeed will go out there and play to compete, even though it probably won't pan out in the win-loss column or on the scoreboard. And let's not forget, too, that there was a terrorist attack here in New Orleans on New Year's Day, bright and early. And in that situation, you're playing for something that's bigger than yourself. And we've seen a bunch that this team is very committed to trying to do something to kind of show some life for its community and give the fans something to cheer for. Fans with a loss get to cheer for the fact that the Atlanta Falcons don't get into the playoffs, potential better draft positioning. Fans with a win would get the opportunity to cheer for a team that finished the season with a win. And in either case, a strong showing is a strong showing. So I would expect the Saints to go out there and try to provide at least that much for this team, with the unlikely scenario that they come out on the winning end of this game up against the better team, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Several injuries that were talked about potentially leading to returns all came up short. Derek Carr, who the Saints maintained over and over again and refuted reports that his season was over, talked about how he was trying to get back out on the football field, ruled out on Friday his season was indeed over after the Week 14 hand injury up against the New York Giants. Chris Olave's season officially is over as well. He was downgraded to out. We never expected that he was going to be back out there. It was great to see him out there at practice as he kind of got back into shape, got back into the swing of things. That then sets him on the right trajectory going into the offseason. No need to risk anything here in the final game. And Alvin Kamara is still listed as doubtful. Would have had to have been upgraded on Saturday to questionable in order to play on Sunday. So he will be inactive more than likely on Sunday, unless something surprising happens. And so those three guys, all three guys who the Saints maintained were trying to come back and refuting these season-ending reports that we've been hearing about, and that even behind the scenes, I was being told like it was unlikely that any of those three were going to be out there, which is why I never played up the fact that they could potentially be out there. Happy to say that they were trying to get out there, but there was never any reason to play up like, hey, I think this is going to be the week, because it never really felt like it was going to be the week. So the Saints, they kept that door open, whether it was for, whether it was for looks, whether it was for gamesmanship, whatever it was, they did it for whatever reason. But all three of those potential returns or comebacks are indeed coming up short, as we expected. Buccaneers wide receiver Mike Evans is on the brink of history. He only needs 85 receiving yards in this game to reach 1,000 receiving yards for the 11th consecutive season. That would tie a record set by NFL legend Jerry Rice in 1966. So a long-standing record there. And the Saints would love nothing more than to make sure that Baker Mayfield and Mike Evans don't get those 85 yards to make sure that he doesn't get that. So a way that the Saints can play spoiler without playing playoff spoiler. But I spoke with one of the Saints coaching staff members on Friday. And one of the things that he said was like, look, if we're missing the playoffs, I'm trying to make sure you don't go to the playoffs either. And so there's a little bit of that fight that this Saints team is showing. But I would expect the secondary to play aggressive between Alontae Taylor and Kool-Aid McKinstry to try to keep Mike Evans short of that 85 receiving yard total. The Tampa secondary, however, will not be in full force. The Tampa Buccaneers are going to be without three key secondary members going into this game. Jamel Dean dealing with a knee injury, Antoine Winfield dealing with an injury as well. And then a scary situation for safety Jordan Whitehead, who was involved in an auto accident on his way to the facility on Saturday, was placed on the non-football injury list and will not be available for Sunday's game. So those will be three players that will be out in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers secondary. I will say first and foremost, I hope everything with Jordan Whitehead is okay. Hope it's just kind of precautionary. No need to go out there and risk anything further. Especially with car accidents, there's always kind of that delayed, how you feel right afterwards versus how you feel the next day kind of thing. And so, but hopefully nothing too big there. We don't know the extent of the injury or if there was any injury, whatever it was. But whatever it was bad enough to keep him out of this game. So hopefully everything's okay. But the Tampa Bay secondary is going to be a little weakened. That could be a good thing for Spencer Rattler, who gets his sixth start here, second start against Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He'll have Marquez Valdes-Scantling available to him in this one and healthy, even though Chris Olave won't be playing. So we'll have one of the top receivers out there. However, just because the Tampa Bay Buccaneers don't have their secondary at full strength doesn't mean that there's still not going to be an impactful defense. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers blitz at the third highest rate in the NFL, and they generate pressure at the fourth highest rate in the NFL. If you look at all quarterbacks across the league that have played, and it's 40 of them that have played at least 200 passing snaps so far this season, had dropbacks. Spencer Rattler is the one that has been pressured the most of those 40. Number one of 40, or number 40 of 40, depending upon how you want to look at it, pressured 42% of the time. So that's going to be a big part of Todd Bowles, the defensive play caller, as well as the head coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, is going to be a big part of his approach as a very blitz-heavy team. They blitz 36% of the time, just 3.9% behind the number one team in the NFL when it comes to that metric. And lastly, this could be it for Darren Rizzi in the city of New Orleans. For a lot of people outside of New Orleans, they just learned who Darren Rizzi is when he took over for the Saints beginning after that bye week in week 11. Had the facial expressions on the sideline that went viral. He had the toilet story that he told before the win up against the Atlanta Falcons, or after the win up against the Atlanta Falcons. That went viral. He had these great, media moments with us and stuff like that. Went on the Pat McAfee show, all this other stuff. But New Orleans Saints fans have kind of grown to know and love Darren Rizzi since 2019 when he showed up as a Saints special teams coordinator. He then became the assistant head coach, and then now, of course, is the interim head coach. And there's still a lot of coaching staff members and a lot of players that love what Darren Rizzi has brought to this team so far, myself included. Actually, I think Darren Rizzi is a great dude. But look, historically, teams that don't make their interim head coach the full-time head coach end up losing that coach. I think the Saints will be motivated to try to find a way to keep Darren Rizzi around. It's going to be a little bit challenging with the dynamic of a new head coach coming in, and you're asking the ex to stick around and all these other things. That could be a little bit challenging to manage that dynamic. But I will say this, Darren Rizzi, if the Saints can get him to stick around, that would be a huge win for New Orleans. So we'll see what happens there. But more than likely, this is the final game for Darren Rizzi. One of those reasons why you can expect this New Orleans Saints team to go out there and at least throw some punches on Sunday, right? Give themselves a fighting chance. We'll see where things go from there. All right, y'all. Wrapping this one up at 5:04 Pacific time, or not Pacific time, PM. Is what I meant to say. Central time. Very fun. I will be doing the Saints pre- and post-game shows tomorrow, so make sure you come through for that over at the New Orleans Saints website, as well as on their YouTube page, social media, all that. We'll be live during the game over at Second and Saints, so make sure you go and get subscribed to John Hendricks and I over at Second and Saints. And of course, we'll be live here after all of that as well, after the game here on Locked On Saints. So make sure if you like this episode, you subscribe, like, do all that stuff, share everything. It's all helpful. I appreciate you all for being here. We have a very eventful offseason, and I promise you, you will be getting everything here that you need all throughout. We appreciate you very much, as always, making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me in the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family is doing, let me know how you living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation. I'll holla at you.